Sam just said, nice to see you. See you later. What's that of it?
Is Irene there? Or? No,
No, she doesn't normally come to theirs.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Shemot, a new book, new characters, new themes, or perhaps not entirely. But let's first of all start off with a summary. So here we have a summary, nice summary. Thank you, Jonathan, for once again preparing this summary for us. And here we are, Shemot in a nutshell. The children of Israel multiply in Egypt. Threatened by the growing numbers, Pharaoh enslaves them and orders the Hebrew midwives, Shifra and Puah, to kill all the male babies at birth. When they do not comply, he commands his people to cast the Hebrew babies into the Nile. A child is born to Yocheved, the daughter of Laban's husband Amram, although we're not told their names in this week's parasha, and placed a basket on the river, while the baby's sister Miriam stands watch from afar. Pharaoh's daughter discovers the boy, raises him as a son, and names him Moses. As a young man, Moses leaves the palace and discovers the hardship of his brethren. He sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew and kills the Egyptian. The next day, he sees two Jews fighting. When he admonishes them, they reveal his deed of the previous day, and Moses is forced to flee to Midian. There he rescues Jethro's daughters, marries one of them, Zipporah, and becomes a shepherd of his father-in-law's flocks. God appears to Moses in a burning bush at the foot of Mount Sinai and instructs him to go to Pharaoh and demand, "Let my people go so that they may serve me." Moses' brother Aaron is appointed to serve as his spokesman. In Egypt, Moses and Aaron assemble the elders of Israel to tell them that the time of their redemption has come. The people believe, but Pharaoh refuses to let them go and even intensifies the suffering of Israel. Moses returns to God to protest. "Why have you done evil to this people?" God promises the redemption is close at hand. And here's a lovely picture of Moses in the basket and Pharaoh's daughter, and we'll get to her name a bit later, and also another depiction of Moses at the burning bush, and we'll talk about that later on too. So thank you to Jonathan for that. We're going to go into the Sedra to identify a number of questions that arise, but I'm going to let the PowerPoint do the talking. This PowerPoint, which I prepared today, I thank Emily Omerod for her for adapting it into a slightly different format, as we will now see. So here we go. Okay, Shemot, why the bush will not burn. The title that I gave this evening's shir is a little bit odd, a little bit strange, but it'll become clear why. And it's the beginnings of slavery and the ingredients for redemption, which are laid out in this parasha if we look very carefully. So Ramban Nachmanides, who lived 1194, Spain, and he died in Israel in 1270. So he made Aliyah in those days, not a simple matter. And he wrote a piece at the beginning of the book of Shemot entitled From Exile to Redemption. The book of Shemot, he said, is dedicated to the first exile and to the redemption from it. But he asked a question, he asked an obvious question. If it's just about the exile and the redemption, why doesn't the book end at the crossing of the Red Sea? Or the very latest, Mount Sinai? Why does it carry on into the whole story of the building of the Mishkan, the tabernacle? Why was that necessary? So he says like this: the exile is not ended until they return to their land and to the spiritual level of their forefathers. When they left Egypt, even though they left the house of slavery, they were still considered to be in a state of exile, for they were in a foreign land, wandering in the wilderness. However, when they reached Mount Sinai and set up the Mishkan, and God returned to them, establishing his Shekhinah, which is God's presence among them, then they returned to the spiritual level of their forefathers, i.e. the presence of God upon their tents. And then they were considered to be redeemed. Now, Ramban really says two things, because he talks about returning to the land of the forefathers, and he talks about the building of the Mishkan and the presence of God, which was the result of the building of the Mishkan. Either way, the redemption is clearly not the day that they walk out of Egypt. And on what the Ramban says, we can have a few questions. So if, as he says, the book of Shemot is from exile to redemption, when he says exile, we really mean suffering in exile to redemption. How do we explain the following verse, which is in the first paragraph? Uvnei Yisrael paru v'yishritzu v'yirbu v'atzu v'mo me'od v'timaleh haaretz otam. The Israelites were fertile and prolific. They multiplied, they increased very greatly, so that the land was filled with them. This is a strong people. And one of the commentaries, the Kli Yakar, on the Bim Od Ma'od, he asked, why did it say Bim Od Ma'od, which means in very, very, or with very, very. And through a series of connections, he says that that means they became very wealthy. So you have the picture of a strong, content, wealthy nation living off the fat of the land. What's so bad about that, that it counts as part of the exile, almost the suffering? Here's another question. If, as the Ramban says, leaving Egypt is not the redemption, what are we celebrating on Pesach? And if the redemption is really spiritual, not physical, then when does the exile begin? So if it's a spiritual redemption, we have to ask really, well, when was the fall? If we say they're returning to the spiritual level of their forefathers, the presence of God rests on their tents in the desert, that seems to be an indication that the presence of God left their tents. So how are we to understand that? When did it happen? And if it did happen, how then did we merit to be redeemed? And Parashat Shemot contains all the ingredients. So, when does a spiritual exile begin? So let's have a look at this verse again. The Israelites were fertile and prolific. They multiplied and increased very greatly, so the land was filled with them. This seems like good news. In fact, it's quite similar to a verse at the end of Vayigash. The very last verse of Vayigash says as follows: Vayeshev Yisrael be'eretz Mitzrayim be'eretz Goshen, ve'achazuva va'yifru va'yirbu ma'od. Israel settled in the country of Egypt, in the region of Goshen. They acquired holdings in it and were fertile and increased greatly. It's very similar. The two verses are pretty similar. And we raised a concern at the end of Vayigash about this last verse, and last week in Vayechi, we also mentioned it again. And we'll come back to that in a moment. Compare the following. In the middle of Vayigash, Jacob and family come to Egypt. The brothers are brought to Pharaoh, and they stand in front of him and they say, Lagur ba'aretz banu. We've come to sojourn in this land. Lagur in Torah terms is to settle temporarily, to sojourn. Whereas at the end of Vayigash, it doesn't say Lagur, it says Vayeshev, they settled. So we mentioned previously the Kli Yakar says this is not a good thing. They settled in such a way as to indicate permanence in the land. That's a change. Not only that, it says Vayechazuva, they acquired holdings in it. What does that mean? Well, you know, this verb to acquire holdings, lechoz, is used often in the Torah with regard to the land of Israel. And here, where it's used with regard to the land of Egypt, that therefore has to be, says the Kli Yakar, that has to be a negative. They're making Egypt their home in a way which was, should we say, excessive. We have an added detail in this week's parasha. Let's go back to the top. Vatimale haaretz otam, the land was filled with them. Sounds like, and Rashi says it's exactly what happened. There were so many of them, they overflowed from Goshen. They lived in different places, and they filled the, not only generally, but the Egyptian cultural places, which were not exactly a bastion of morality. And this is where the exile began. It wasn't oppression by Pharaoh at that point, but it was an alienation of their very identity connection with God. It wasn't total, of course, because they kept their names and they kept their language, but in terms of their way of life, it was far removed, a far cry from Jacob and sons. We also refer to Rashi, the beginning of Vayechi, or recall from last week's shiur, we said there's no gap between the end of Vayigash and Vayechi. And Rashi says one reason is because their eyes closed because of the shibud. Now, shibud would be translated as slavery. It doesn't have to be slavery. It could just mean their connection, strong connection with, well, whatever it was. And in this case, the Egyptian society. So that verse at the end of Vayigash is seen as a negative, and therefore the comparable verse here in Shemot, which sounds like good news, actually isn't. It shouldn't have been the land was filled with them. It should have been, let's think about going back to the land of Israel. And at the Pesach Seder, we are careful to make the distinction. Yes, their descent to Egypt was anus al bihadibur, clearly orchestrated. How long they stayed, well, we don't find any indication that they may have wanted something different. But let's move on. That's the spiritual exile. What about the physical exile, the suffering? When does that begin? So very soon afterwards, in fact, the very next verse says, Vayakom melech hadash al Mitzrayim, asher lo yada et Yosef. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. The Kli Yakar has a fascinating comment on this. Rashi has the obvious comments. Was he new? Some say he was new. Some say he made himself out to be new, just pretend he didn't know Joseph. Kli Yakar says something quite deep. He points out that this word, Vayakom, the king arose. The term to arise suggests violence. And he brings many examples, the earliest of which is Cain arose against Abel, and then we know he killed him. Here the sense is that all his actions, Pharaoh's actions, caused God's wrath to descend upon Egypt with the plagues and other suffering. So it's as if the new king arose against his people. By his actions, he brought suffering on the people. What's this who did not know Joseph? Again, Kli Yakar, fascinating explanation. Had Pharaoh known Joseph's full story right from the beginning, he had the dreams, and his brothers did their best to prevent the fulfillment of his dreams. But their very actions brought about their fulfillment. Had he known all of that, he might have not done what he did. By that I mean that It was Pharaoh's actions against the Israelites that caused them to thrive even more and ultimately to do what he dreaded, they get up and leave the country. That's what he said. I'm scared. They're so numerous, they get up and leave the country. So here we go. Pharaoh's War, chapter 1, Pharaoh's War against and frustration with the people. What do I mean by no names? Although the Sedra starts off with the names of Jacob and sons when they came down to Egypt, after that, before we get to Shifra and Puah, the midwives, we don't have any names of any individuals. They're like faceless. Now, we can detect 4 stages in this first chapter of oppression. Stage 1, taskmasters. So he says, let us deal wisely with them, lest they increase. So he appointed over the nation the taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. They built treasure centers for Pharaoh, Pithom, and Ramses. But the more they afflicted it, the nation, the more they increased and grew. So Pharaoh said, let's deal wisely, lest they increase. But the more they afflicted, actually, the more they increased. And so they became revolted by us. Stage 2, harsh slavery. What does it say? We read this at Pesach Seder, this verse. They made their lives bitter with hard labor, with mortar, and with rigor. Stage 3, midwives. And here we have the first sign of hope. King of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, Shifra and Puah, when you deliver the Hebrew babies, if it's a boy, you put him to death. If it's a girl, she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt said to them, and they saved the children alive. And God dealt well with the midwives, and what? The people multiplied and increased greatly. If Pharaoh had examined the Joseph story, he wouldn't have done these things. But like him and like all the anti-Semites afterwards, they didn't read the history books. And each one, well, actually they did, and they thought, yes, but they can do it in a different way and they will be successful. But no. And stage 4, so Pharaoh commanded all of his nations, saying, every boy that is born, you shall cast in the river. We're going to revisit this verse in a moment. That's the end of chapter 1. And we're left wondering, now what? Just want to note the following. In this passage, we have Pharaoh or king 7 times. 7 times we have either Israel or the nation or it, third person. And 7 times we have a reference to their increase in numbers or their power, their strength, whatever it is. The number 7, as we know, is a very common number, but the Torah is clearly pitting with its choice of words, Pharaoh against Am Yisrael, against the people of Israel. Before we get to that very last verse and revisit, a word about the midwives. So what does it say about the midwives? Vatirena ham yaldot et Elohim v'lo asu kasher ba'alei melech Mitzrayim v'tchayena et ha'iladim. The midwives, fearing God, did not do as the king of Egypt had told them. And you see how I translated this. This is not how most Chumashim translated. But v'tchayena et ha'iladim, they caused the boys to live. It doesn't just mean they didn't kill them. It means they did what they could to make sure that they would be viable. The Ibn Ezra explains as follows. Simply, they went over and above the call of duty. The Netziv, who lived at the end of the 19th century, I forgot to put his biography in, not just Shifra and Puah, but actually they motivated others. When it says third person, Hamyaldot, the midwives, without naming them, he says it's not only Shifra and Puah, it's others. As Sivan Rav Meir said in a message this morning, well, with Shifra and Puah, this is the first ever recorded health service and the first account of refusing to obey immoral orders. And I want to pause at this point. We're in a very difficult time. Then it was difficult, and now it's difficult for other reasons. And once again, we recognize, we give thanks to the healthcare professionals in this country and around the world who are called upon to be what we call Moser Nefesh. Shifra and Puah put their lives in danger with the work that they did. And the healthcare professionals, frankly, are doing the same in a direct sort of way with coming into contact with COVID, but even in an indirect sort of way, because many of them have to work incredibly long hours and it has to be draining and physically taxing. And we pray that God will give them strength and give all of us strength to come through the crisis that we're in. And I also want to say that this week's parasha contains a number of ingredients for the redemption, and no one was aware of it at the time. Not until Moses came to the burning bush. Shifra and Puah, for sure, think they'll be recorded for posterity, that they're part of the redemption story? No, they just felt they were doing what they needed to do. And here's the second part of the redemption story. And we're told, a certain man from Levi married a certain woman. They had a child. And yes, they did incredible things, but they would have seen themselves as perfectly ordinary people. You know, when Rabbi Sachs passed away, one of the comments we heard was, Rabbi Sachs was not born Rabbi Sachs. He grew into it, he developed. And Amram and Yocheved, Moshe's parents, what did they think? I think they thought they had a crisis. And the Midrash says, in fact, they didn't even want to be married to each other at that time because of the danger of having a baby boy. Their daughter Miriam persuaded them. So they did not see themselves as special, and it seems clear that neither did Moses. But we'll get to that later on. Let's go back to the verse that we looked at before, the very last verse of chapter 1. And here it is. Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born you shall throw into the Nile. Okay, that's the headline really, and it sounds terrible, but actually, in a way, it's like the first verse of the second chapter. The first chapter is about the nation as a whole, faceless masses of people. Here it's about one man marrying a woman. Certain man in the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw how good he was, she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took a wicker basket and put the child into the basket, placed it among the reeds by the banks of the Nile. And his sister stationed herself at a distance to learn what would befall him. Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe in the Nile, while her maidens walked along the Nile. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to take it. When she opened it, she saw a child, a boy crying. She took pity on it and said, "This must be a Hebrew child." His sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I fetch you a Hebrew nurse to suckle the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter answered, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said, "Nurse this child, and I will pay your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, who made him her son. She named him Moses, explaining, "I drew him out of the water." Ladies and gentlemen, if Pharaoh had realized Joseph's story, that his brothers put him in the pit, thinking that's the end of his dreams, But actually, the putting him in the pit and sending him to Egypt brought about the dreams. He would never have done what he did. Pharaoh's decree about the children in the river brought about the situation that the savior of the Jewish people is going to be brought up by his daughter in his palace. And you can see how I've color-coded certain words. The emotional word son, every son that is born, throw them in the river. So this woman from Levi had a son, and Pharaoh's daughter made him her son. Let's go back. You see, I put saw and took, the same colors. She saw how good he was. Who's that? Moses' mother. And she took a wicker basket. Pharaoh's daughter saw the basket among the reeds, sent a slave girl to take it. Same combination. And we have it again. The woman took the child. Before that, Pharaoh saw the child. And then the mother took the child back and nursed it. And of course, Pharaoh's daughter is emphasized. Why don't we call her a name? Well, isn't it to make the point that it's Pharaoh's daughter, the daughter of the one who made this horrible decree? And of course, the emotional word child occurs, to my count, 6 times in this passage. So it's not just the story itself, it's a choice of words used by the Torah to make these very, very strong points. Rabbi Sachs, Olav Hasholem, to say we saw his grave today at the entrance to Bushy Cemetery. How strange, he says, that the hero of the Exodus, greatest of all the prophets, should bear not the name his parents have used thus far, but the one given to him by his adoptive mother, an Egyptian princess. And the Midrash draws our attention to the fact that this is the reward for those who do kindness. Although Moses had many names, the only one by which he's known in the whole Torah is the one given to him by the daughter of Pharaoh. Even the Holy One, blessed be he, did not call him by any other name. Indeed, Moshe, Moses, is an Egyptian name meaning child. Who then was Pharaoh's daughter? The first book of Chronicles mentions a daughter of Pharaoh named Bitya, and it was she the sages identified as the woman who saved Moses. The name Bitya, or some say Batya, means the daughter of God. From this, the sages drew one of their most striking lessons. The Holy One, blessed be, said to her, Moses was not your son, yet you called him your son. You are not my daughter, but I shall call you my daughter. Isn't that just beautiful? So now Moshe grows up. And what do we see? Moshe grew up and he went out to his brothers and saw in their burdens. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brothers. I just want to make it very clear the terms of the text, which I put in bold in Hebrew. Vahi bayomim hahem. So in those days, Vaikdal Moshe. Moshe grew up. Vayetze, and he went out. Where did he go out? El Echav. Moshe's had this privileged upbringing. Where? The palace of Pharaoh. They even made a film, The Prince of Egypt. And maybe he was. But he went out El Echav. The Torah emphasizes Echav, his brothers. And it doesn't say Vayar et Sivlotam, and he saw their burdens. It says Vayar bersivlotam. He saw in their burdens. Vayar, and he saw Ish Mitzri, an Egyptian man, doing what? Makeh Ish Ivri Me'echav, striking a Hebrew man of his brothers. If we would wonder the answer to the following question, Moshe's identity is a Hebrew. His upbringing is an Egyptian. Which side of the fence does he stand on? We get the answer in this verse. Twice we're told Echav. And we're told Ish Ivri versus Ish Mitzri. And here's the result. He killed the Egyptian. He subsequently intervened between two fighting and critical Hebrews. Who were you to intervene? He ran to Midian. He saw shepherd men bullying the shepherd women, and he intervened. Moshe demonstrates care and courage, and he stands for what is right, whether of his people or not. This is another ingredient of the redemption. Moshe as a leader, he doesn't know it yet. Rabbi Sachs quipped that he was criticized for his leadership by these two fighting Hebrews, and he wasn't even a leader yet. But we can see, we looking back can see that all these things demonstrated what is required of a leader and that he was that man. There is actually another quality, and that's humility, which becomes apparent soon. Let's look at the burning bush. So, in the left side, we've got the verses from the Torah. Vayera malach Hashem. So meanwhile, Moses has moved to Midian. He's living with his father-in-law, Yitro, Jethro, married his daughter, and he's a shepherd. And one day, he goes deep into the desert, and he comes to Chorev, which is another name for Mount Sinai. And we're told, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire out of a bush. And he gazed, and there was the bush all aflame, and yet the bush was not consumed. Moshe said, I must turn aside to look at this amazing sight. Why doesn't the bush burn? Madua lo yiva hasneh. So the English translation is in the present tense, but the Hebrew is not in the present tense. Madua lo yiva hasneh. Why will the bush not burn? In the worst days of the Intifada, in December 2000, I was part of a group that went to Israel with then Chief Rabbi Sachs, and we had a varied conference, but it was a very, very tense time. There were bombs going off all over the place. It was really awful, and at the same time, there was pressure being brought to bear on Israel to make lots of concessions. It was a very, very tough time. And in the middle of all of this, we were treated to the performance of a band of young men playing music, very spiritual sort of music. And they called their band Vasne Enen Ukal. The bush was not consumed. And they were making a point. And here we are, Baruch Hashem, 20 years later. Here's a couple of midrashim. Why did the Holy One, blessed be He, appear to Moshe in this fashion? It's because Moshe thought in his heart that perhaps the Egyptians would destroy the people of Israel. It's all finished. Therefore, the Holy One, blessed be He, showed him a fire that burned but did not consume. And he said to him, just as the thorn bush burns in the fire but is not consumed, so too the Egyptians cannot destroy the people of Israel. That's one midrash. It cannot happen. We haven't said why not. The Midrash Tanchuma asked another question. Why out of the midst of a thorn bush and not a taller tree like a palm? For the Holy One, blessed be He, said, and the Hebrew is, Imu anochi b'tzara, I am with them in their troubles. Just as they are suffering in oppression, so too I am in the confines of the bush that is entirely thorns. So what we're saying is that God within the bush, and is not getting burned because he's within the bush. And if he's saying, Imu anochi b'tzara, I'm with the Israelites in their time of sorrow, what he's really saying is, Moshe, don't worry, they are going to get out of this. Of course, what he was going to say now is, and here how it's going to happen. You have a role to play. So let's have a look at this again. So when the Lord saw he turned aside to look, God called out to him from the bush, Moshe, Moshe, and he answered, here I am. And he said, do not come closer, remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you stand is holy ground. I am, he said, the God of your father, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob. And Moshe hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. And the Lord continued, I've surely seen the plight of my people in Egypt, and I've heeded their outcry because of their taskmasters. Yes, I am mindful of their sufferings. I've come down to rescue them from the Egyptians and to bring them out of that land to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Now the cry of the Israelites has reached me. Moreover, I have seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So if I was Moses, I'd say, okay, this is amazing stuff. Very nice. What's it got to do with me? Come, therefore, I will send you to Pharaoh, and you shall free my people, Israelites, from Egypt. Just want to make the point. Moses was 80. We find this out in next week's parasha. Moses was 80, 80. You could say he's lived his life. And most of it's been actually rather peaceful ever since he fled Egypt, you know, living in the desert, shepherd, far from the crowds. Go back to Egypt? Free my people? Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and liberate the Israelites from Egypt? By the way, this is the last quality that Moshe needed as leader, and that's humility. When he said, who am I? He meant it. But Moses said something else, and we'll see in a moment what he was conveying by this verse. God responded, I will be with you, and this is the sign that I have sent when you liberate the people of Israel from Egypt, then you will serve the Lord upon this very mountain. Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and liberate the Israelites from Egypt? Rashi says, what Moses was really saying is, who says they even deserve it? I saw how they quarreled with each other. And God responded, I will be with you. And this is the sign that I sent you. When you liberate the people from Egypt, then you will serve the Lord upon this very mountain. And Rashi says, just as the bush was not consumed because I'm in it, so I will be with you and protect you. They don't yet deserve it, but they will. The Ramban says, okay, so they deserve, what do you mean they don't deserve it? They will. They will come to this mountain. There will be the giving of the Torah and the building of the Mishkan. And this takes us back to right to the beginning. The Ramban says the Mishkan at the center of the camp was a perpetuation of the Sinai experience. Mount Sinai, God at the epicenter of the mountain, if you like, or top of the mountain. And they built the Mishkan. God's presence was over the Mishkan. So that really takes us right back to the start of the beginning of the Shiur. In fact, the name of this series, From Slavery to Sanctuary, the Tabernacle. And the Ramban said, we recall, that the book is from exile to freedom, and it is this spiritual freedom that we have, which started, the spiritual slavery started when they really, in Egypt, more or less forgot who they were and where they were supposed to be. That was when the spiritual slavery started, but it was recovered when it got to Mount Sinai. So we say, what are we celebrating at Pesach? We are celebrating the physical freedom. That has to come first. But it's the spiritual freedom which is the real target. Shalach Ami, Moses is going to say many times in the next few weeks, Send my people v'yavduni, that they should serve me, because that's the essence of it. However, there are challenges ahead. Things don't go so well. The Pharaoh who did not know Yosef doesn't know God either. Who is God that I should listen to him? And so he makes the impression even worse. And the Israelites complain, and so does Moses. This is a quote from the Torah, the very end of this week's Sedra, Parashat. The Israelite leaders said to them, Moses and Aaron, may the Lord look upon you and punish you for making us loathsome to Pharaoh and his courtiers, putting a sword in their hands to slay us. Then Moses returned to the Lord and said, O Lord, why did you bring harm upon this people? Why did you send me? Ever since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he's dealt worse with this people, and still you've not delivered your people. It's a grim ending to the Sedra. It's actually not the last verse. The last verse is that God says, you wait and see. Pharaoh will yet send out the people. Patience. And the Sedra ends. We've had a few weeks of cliffhangers, and this is another one. So I look forward to welcoming you back next week to see what actually happens next. But meanwhile, a reminder that we tonight have gone through a number of ingredients of redemption, and they mostly would not have known it. Pharaoh's stubbornness is the first ingredient. It starts that he didn't know fully the Joseph story. Had he known that, he would have drawn certain conclusions. And it ends with, well, who's God that I'm going to release the Israelites? I don't know God. I'm certainly not going to set them free. So one of the ironic signs of redemption coming is Pharaoh himself. Another sign is the behavior of the midwives, that amongst such crises, there are such idealists and people who stand up for what is right. That's the second sign. The third sign, Pharaoh's daughter. Incredible. And the irony is just so beautiful. And of course, I didn't emphasize this, but the behavior of Miriam in watching over her younger brother was also an essential ingredient. The courage of Amram and Yocheved to have a child at this time, and what the mother did with the child, putting the basket in the river, hoping, praying, all of these things. But then Moses himself exercising his own freedom of choice, and they're all exercising their freedom of choice, but all these are ingredients building up to that moment at Mount Sinai, where Moses wonders, why will the bush not be consumed? And I want to suggest, well, part of the answer is clearly because God said, because I'm not going to allow it, and that is the bottom line. But I'd also like to suggest it's the behavior of all these courageous individuals who probably didn't even see it that way, that they were courageous individuals. They just did what was right. It's their behavior that also created the backdrop, the preparation for our ultimate redemption. And the truth is the same today. We're in difficult times. Small actions by each one of us, which we may think are insignificant, can all build to a bigger picture that we, as a community, as families, the world, should pull together and know redemption from the current situation that we are facing. Good night.